Welcome back to the Broncos Blitz podcast. My name is Shawn Drotar, your host. You can follow me on Twitter at SDROTAR, and delighted to be joined by, a man that I get to work with a lot of the time, which is a treat. The inimitable Sandy Clough. You can catch us both, by the way, from 2 to 4 p.m. every weekday, only on Mile High Sports, but you can catch that any way you'd like, whether that's over the air, whether that's on milehighsports.com, whether that's on the free Mile High Sports app, any way you'd like. Sandy, thanks for joining me on this podcast where we can take kind of a deeper dive into some of the things that were going on for the Broncos, that now that we are done with all the organized team activities, it is basically the dead zone up prior to training camp.
It is. And in the past, you would worry about players getting into trouble during this 6-week interregnum period. I don't know that the Broncos have so much to worry about in that way, but there's still a lot of unknowns. Listen, Sean Payton's a seasoned coach. He's had a full off season, which, for example, John Fox did not have back in 2011 when there was the lockout going on.
Good point.
So the Broncos didn't do any unusual things. The Jets, for example, canceled their mandatory minicamp, which seemed a concession to Aaron Rodgers at the very least. But things have gone along, I think, in a way that suggests that it will be purely about business in 2023, for better or for worse. And I don't foresee tremendous improvement over last year and the one lost record necessarily, but I think it'll be a completely different environment.
Yeah, it does feel like it's sort of a reset. And sometimes the NFL does allow, because of the salary cap, the opportunity to maybe turn a franchise around faster in the NFL than you can in other sports, certainly. But it doesn't mean it happens instantly. And although it seems like every year there is a worst to first team that makes the playoffs, for the Broncos, that's pretty tough because we know who occupies first place. That's the Kansas City Chiefs. But the addition of Sean Payton, I think, is going to be extraordinarily impactful. Sometimes you talk about a coaching tree, right? And Sean Payton comes off the Bill Belichick coaching tree, but there are guys
Bill
that
Parcells,
yeah,
and Belichick,
but coming from that Parcells tree. And in certain cases, you look at a guy like a Belichick who takes some of that from Parcells and then makes it his own. Sean Payton, and I mean this in no negative way, is really more of a Parcells clone in many ways, not really taking his own spin on it, but just literally taking what Parcells did and keeping those tenets going forward.
That's an excellent observation, because Parcells obviously was a defensive oriented coach. That was his area of expertise throughout his coaching career, really. Payton is the offensive version of Bill Parcells. I think their coaching styles are similar. I think they're direct, but they're also, in the best sense of the term, manipulative. They aren't above poking players here and there if they feel like it. And he's not taking over a team or even an organization that's been in anything but disarray for the past 7 years.
Only Justin Simmons, who was arrived at the team following the Broncos 2015 Super Bowl season, arrived in 2016 for that 9-7 Broncos campaign, has been the only Denver Bronco that has experienced a winning season as a Denver Bronco. And even that was not very much. And again, it was 2016. So it feels, with the new ownership, that the time was right to hand it over to a guy like Sean Payton and just say, hey, you do what you need to do. There really aren't any rules here. There really aren't any things that we have to keep around. You reinvent this team the way you think it needs reinvented. And sometimes, although you don't want to be in that position as a franchise where you actually realize that you almost just have to reset everything, but it can also be liberating, because you can now take some of that culture, take the way that the organization works, and get it going the right way from the start. And Sean Payton, depending on how you feel about him personally, the issues with Bountygate and the way he handled that, obviously there's some concerns about that, the way people perceive him. But there's no question, given his career history, that he is a proven winner and a consistent winner. The man doesn't have, when you talk about losing seasons in his career,
that would be 3. And they were all 7-9 seasons.
7-9.
2000,
that's the worst he's been.
7, 7-9, and then successive 7-9 seasons in 14 and 15, and an 8-8 season in 2008. Otherwise, he was winning 11, 12 games a year in New Orleans. 9 playoff seasons out of 15. 9 seasons in which the Saints offensively were one of the top 5 scoring teams in the NFL, including 5 of the last 6 years in New Orleans. Of course, the 6th year, the final year in New Orleans, was a season played without Drew Brees, a quarterback for Sean Payton. Now, that'll get us to Russell Wilson, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But this is clearly a seasoned coach. 28th all-time in games coached, 23rd in all-time wins, 24th in all-time win percentage among coaches who have performed for at least 50 games. And among his contemporaries, I think in total number of wins, you've got Belichick, you've got Reed, you've got Tomlin, you've got Carroll, and you've got Mike McCarthy. He's a top 10 coach in the NFL by any measure. He sat out a year, but
it's
it
not
wasn't
as if it's passed him by or anything, right?
As if he went on sabbatical for that year. He was working for Fox, and he, like some of his predecessors here, Mike Shannon comes to mind very quickly. Mike Shanahan, a film nut. And so is Sean Payton.
The move by Payton to get hired was interesting, of course, because I think Payton and his agent, of course, were leveraging potential teams for the jobs. And I didn't get the impression, quite frankly, that Denver was the first job he wanted. Now, every coach, when they're hired, talks about this is the job they really wanted. It appeared that perhaps Sean Payton would hope that the Dallas job would have opened up. That appeared to be his preference. But regardless,
unfortunately for him, Dallas made the playoffs last year and saved Mike McCarthy's job in the process.
Otherwise, it very well may have gone that way. But however the Broncos end up getting him, they get him. And now Sean Payton is fully motivated to prove that his second act will be as good as his first. And that leads us, of course, you talked about the very successful football marriage of Drew Brees and Sean Payton and how well that had worked. And it's easy to forget, even though Brees was the first overall pick of the second round in the year he came out, looked pretty good until he was hurt against Denver, as a matter of fact. He was sacked on a safety and injured the shoulder.
Final game of the 2005 season, I believe.
I think that's right.
And he was considered damaged goods by most teams in the league, including the Miami Dolphins, whose coach at the time was Nick Saban, and he really wanted Brees. And the medical people, probably in addition to the front office staff in Miami at the time, said no. He's got a bad shoulder, and he's never going to be able to throw the way he once did, and he was never known as a particularly strong-arm quarterback to begin with. Saban turns out to be right, and Payton, in his first year in New Orleans, 2006, has Drew Brees and goes 10-6 that first year and makes the playoffs and actually wins a playoff game. And I don't know that New Orleans was in better shape when Payton took over than Denver is now. So there are really some encouraging pieces of Payton's history for Bronco fans to consider.
And there's parallels there, because that leads me to Russell Wilson, damaged goods coming off. Now, the injury that he had in Seattle was minor, of finger, but now, of course, he has had a couple injuries after his first year.
How about Denver. 5?
Yeah. So to an extent, damaged goods. Both guys, their height considered to be something of a detriment.
Right.
Arm strength concern potentially as Russell Wilson starts to decline. No question about Russell Wilson's arm strength over the course of his career, but now at his age, it is in decline. So you're talking about guys with injuries that are shorter, that arm strength is a question. There are more similarities between Drew Brees of first arriving with Sean Payton and Russell Wilson now with his first year with Sean Payton than it might look at the surface.
Wilson is 34. Drew Brees is not 34 in 2006.
No.
So
the age gap is vastly different.
The shoulder injury was considered
similarities
to be
are not
right.
There's
some
to it.
The idea that Wilson and Brees have been close personal friends, unquestionable, that they have been friendly down through the years. And I'm sure Wilson knows a lot about Payton from what Drew Brees has told him. But Brees and Payton had some kind of telepathy going on where no one else in the room could really understand them, but they could understand each other. And I wonder if Russell Wilson is capable of developing that sort of relationship with his head coach. His job may depend on his doing so.
On the bright side, Wilson has been amenable to being coached by Sean Payton before, because when he had that famous list of 6 teams of which he could be traded to, one of them, when Payton was the coach, was the Saints. Now, obviously, Drew Brees was there for the majority of it, so why would you worry about making a trade there? But at the same time, it does show that when Wilson looks at coaches that he believes he would either like or could help him be better, Sean Payton was one of those guys that at least he was comfortable with. So it's not as if he's being handed a coach that they will immediately be at loggerheads with.
I don't know that I trust his judgment, though. This is the guy who wanted to get away from Pete Carroll and the offensive coaching staff as fast as he could, and even get away from some of his teammates whom he regarded as inferior,
many of whom
to Denver's players, and that did not turn out to be the case.
A lot of players over the last years of Wilson's career, some notable ones, spending some time last year actually calling him out on podcasts like this or in interviews. Marshawn Lynch, one of them. I mean, surprising big stars of those Seattle teams.
Virtually everyone on defense from the Legion of Boom.
Yes.
Has called out Wilson, even when they were playing with him in Seattle after they won that first Super Bowl. And in subsequent seasons, when Seattle remained very much a contender for conference honors, if not to actually win the Super Bowl, if they could get there. I think the quote that jumped out at me from last week's minicamp came from offensive coordinator Joe Lombardi, because we remember last year that however much blame you place on Hackett vis-a-vis Wilson, Wilson vis-a-vis Hackett, combination of the two, maybe some other factors that served to submarine their ability to work together professionally, it seemed clear that Hackett was kind of a laissez-faire coach and wanted Wilson to be comfortable and basically let him do anything he wanted to do.
Yes.
And there's Joe Lombardi coming out roughly a week ago at the minicamp talking about Wilson, he's used to doing things a certain way. We know that to be true. And we're presenting a new way of doing things. And this harkens back to Payton's comments at his introductory press conference. We meet in a certain way. We practice in a certain way. We train in a certain way, and it's not for everybody. I think it remains an open question with Russell Wilson. Is he prepared for something new? Can you teach the proverbial old dog new tricks when he has seemed resistant to that in the past? Seattle tried to change him. He didn't want to change. Hackett may or may not have tried to change him. I tend to think he was more than happy to let Wilson do what Wilson was supposed to be good at doing. Yeah. But the result of that was Russell Wilson, the renowned deep thrower, was one of the worst deep throwers in the National Football League a year ago in 80 pass attempts of 20 or more air yards.
And for Wilson, that was one of his main strengths, one of the better passing, at least at virtually every metric, deep passers. But at the same time, Wilson, in part because of his height, in part because of his hyper aggressiveness to kind of go for the kill shot with regularity. If you want to guard against Russell Wilson, what people have learned is you just guard the sidelines. He doesn't use the middle of the field very
outside
often,
the numbers
on the deep
for him
shot.
Seems preferable,
right,
to between it.
And that makes sense. He's a smaller guy. He likes to roll out, get the time, by the time. The problem is, as he ages and is moving a little bit slower, even that half second makes a difference, and he doesn't have a particularly skilled offensive line, you're actually looking for a recipe for disaster. And his sacks, which coming into Denver in the previous 3 years had gotten to 3.3 per, which is bad, jumped to 3.8 almost in the last year for the Broncos. So he's still holding onto the ball too long. Plus, he didn't have the offensive line. It means that those kind of plays aren't going to be around with regularity in that case. And so what Payton and company have to do, and you're right, in Wilson's case, there's been resistance. It was resistance for years in Seattle. You heard Payton also allude in his opening press conference, we're not doing your own coaches and your other people don't have the keys to the building.
There will be no second floor office for
it's
Russell Wilson at Dove Valley.
This is going to be for football only. The rest of it, we know what Russell Wilson makes. You can rent, you can go to a WeWork or something and rent your own spot. But the Broncos, when they're talking about presenting something different, that's where you go back to Sean Payton. It's not a presenting as if someone's bringing you a wine to sample at a restaurant where you can decide this one isn't what I want, send it back. It's a nice way of saying this is how we do it. I got hired to do this. I have a mandate. Get on board or I'll find someone else who will.
So this is the coordinator saying this, and the head coach kind of saying the same thing about the whole team at the introductory news conference, which was refreshing because now we seem to have, for the first time in some time, a coach who really wants to coach the whole team,
right?
And not just defense, Vic Fangio, not just offense, Nathaniel Hackett.
Yep.
And basically leave everything else to your coordinators. Listen, there are all kinds of coaches who win in the NFL. There are CEO types. There are people who tend to micromanage a little more. Belichick comes to mind because he continues to have the smallest coaching staff in the league. Sean Payton has brought in a coaching staff that is not necessarily star-studded, but you know what? The Broncos have had star assistant coaches in the past, and more often than not, they haven't done real well.
Well, and even if they
do,
for
whatever reason,
then they leave. And there's a concern with that too. So sometimes having the folks that you believe in that are going to be reliable are helpful. So let's get down to that sort of brass tacks then. How do you think that relationship will work? And even more importantly, I guess, for Broncos fans and for the final result, how much better can Russell Wilson be? Where do you see the difference between the physical decline of his game and the fact that he had a coach that basically was over his skis in the first year and realized, I have a guy that's made the Pro Bowl umpteen times. I'm just going to kind of trust him to do his thing. That didn't work. And I think some of that does have to come into play. You know, Wilson is clearly a guy that needs coaching, whether he necessarily likes it or not. And he really didn't get it last year. When you go from zero to quality coaching all of a sudden, and we can talk about Davis Webb, the QB coach, and how much that might or might not play into things. But how much better do you think Russell Wilson statistically can be? How much better? You talked about maybe the results won't look as good, but it will look more like an NFL team that's on the rise.
Well, I think the results almost have to be better, don't they? Because it's hard to be worse than he was last year. Than this offense was last year, failing to average even 17 points per game. And that's in spite of a late season surge. I don't know what to call it. Surge is probably too strong a term. But the bottom line is they averaged 16.9 points per game in 2022. Yes, they will do better than that because Sean Payton's offensive teams in New Orleans always did better than that with or without Drew Brees. Now, again, the caveat is that Brees was there for every year that Payton coached, save for the last year. And they went 9-8 and they were 19th in scoring, but they were fourth on the defensive side of the ball. And I would think they look at this defensive group, Vance Joseph, interestingly enough, the coordinator now, and they say, well, we can be a top 10 defense, maybe even a top 5 defense with what we've got. We've talked about whether that's realistic or not, but I think on offense, I think Wilson, if he's really studied Payton, will realize in his last 3 years in New Orleans, the Saints were 5th in completion rate between the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And he would be more than amenable, I would hope, to saying, all right, I'm going to work on the intermediate throws in the middle of the field where I can find a person I didn't have last year at my disposal, Tim Patrick, who's a big target in the middle of the field. And yards after catch in New Orleans, listen, they were averaging 5.8 yards after the catch in the last 5 years that Sean Payton was the coach.
And here's where the Broncos have a secret weapon. We saw the way that the Broncos used Jerry Jeudy, who seemed to finally come into his own a little bit, especially when the Broncos used him in the way that, quite frankly, most analysts thought the Broncos would use him. Slants, get him into space. He's a good route runner. He runs really tight routes. He does have good hands. He's electric after the catch. The Broncos started to use him in routes over the middle and timing routes and let him create. And Wilson and Jeudy actually had a very good connection to the end of the season, enough that you believe that that might be something to build on. If not, maybe the primary weapon in the passing game next year.
Well, I think Jerry Jeudy has to be their leading pass
but
receiver,
even that
their
style
most dangerous receiver. Yeah. But Tim Patrick coming back will make a difference. I don't know where that puts Cortland Sutton, but of course, in today's NFL, we all know you need at least 3 wide receivers who can be productive. And the Broncos last year did not have Tim Patrick at all beyond the first few days of training camp. So there is some reason for concern, I think, in other places. But at the wide receiver position, this is up to Peyton and, frankly, up to Russell Wilson in determining how best to use these people. But I'm looking at 2021, just without Drew Brees. The Saints averaged 5.76 yards after the catch. Brees had retired by then.
Exactly. And I think when you talked about that 19th in the league in scoring, remember, by the way, that would actually be a 13-spot promotion for the Denver Broncos from last year. That's how bad it was.
That would be dead last. I believe, last. If my math is correct. Let's see, 13
19
plus
13
19 equals 32. And 2. Last time I looked,
just behind the
teams.
Houston Texans, last seen drafting a quarterback number 2 overall because they didn't have anybody.
Even the Houston Texans scored more than the
Denver Broncos. They added, by the way, Marvin Mims Jr. in the second round, as well as another wide receiver. So the stable there is full. Let's move to the other part of this equation, the offensive line. Now, the offensive line from left to right, as it stands, would be Garrett Bowles, new addition Ben Powers out of Baltimore, Lloyd Cushenberry. You would have Quinn Miners at right guard, and then the big money addition, in particular, Mike McGlinchey at right tackle. On paper, even though this may not look like one of the very best offensive lines in football, it is probably the best offensive line the Broncos have assembled since they won the Super Bowl in 2015.
You damn with faint praise, but I think that's right.
You're trending upwards.
Because McGlinchey has been, considering where he was drafted, somewhat of a disappointment. But by Bronco standards, he seems to be a guy who can be counted on maybe to stay healthy. And I don't know if he plays all 17 games, but the Broncos at right tackle would take 15, 16 games happily from McGlinchey this year. And his play would almost have to be an upgrade over any right tackle the Broncos have used, really, since Orlando Franklin in 2013. Hard as that is to believe, Miners has to stay healthy at right guard. When he was healthy, he played relatively well last year. Cushenberry is supposedly bigger.
He's apparently bigger.
We'll see what that means.
The Broncos did not make a significant move to upgrade that position, which was something of a surprise, although it's not a surprise given the fact that Cushenberry really has everything you want in an NFL center, except
he's got a good head
and size,
and he
everything
and Wilson
else is there
seemed to get along last year.
Right.
Well, again, that was not worth much, but they did seem to get along. Powers, I believe, is an upgrade over Dalton Reisner, and maybe that says more about Reisner than it says about Powers. And Bowles, I think, is somewhat of a question mark, not the least. Among other reasons, not the least of which is the fact he's coming back from a very serious leg injury. He was second-team All-Pro in 2020, but that was kind of a weird year, as we all know. And until proven otherwise, it looks like an anomaly.
Dalton Reisner, by the way, as we record this, just about 5 weeks out of training camp, is unsigned. Entirely unsigned. So it's hard to argue that Powers wouldn't be an upgrade.
A sense of his value that goes well beyond what other teams feel about him.
Seem to feel. So obviously for the Broncos, they think that's better. So the last part of the equation, as we kind of look at this here, is the way the Broncos try to build. And yes, if you're Broncos fans, you're familiar with some of the names. Jerry Jeudy was a huge star at Alabama. Russell Wilson, of course, up until last year, looked like an absolute lock for the Hall of Fame. Last year's season so disastrous that maybe called that into question. But you're talking about beyond that, maybe if he had not been hurt, Javonte Williams would be in that mix. But when you're talking about honest to goodness star players, are there name players with the Broncos? Sure. Broncos fans know Cortland Sutton very well. That there are some other players that they're familiar with. But around the league, teams would say the Broncos have exactly two stars.
Justin Simmons is unquestionably a star and an all-pro caliber player in any given year. Patrick Surtain seems to be moving in that direction. There were portions of the season last year in which he looked exceptional, mainly in the first half of the season. And then during the second half of the season, he seemed to level off. I happen to think that the Broncos might be in slightly better position with respect to depth at the corner position than people tend to imagine. But otherwise, apart from those two players, it's time to show and not tell. I think probably going into this season, their third best defensive player could very well be DJ Jones, but he's a nose tackle.
Right.
And nose tackles rarely play more than 35 to 40% of the time, if that much, even the good ones. And so, again, we look at the Zach Allens and the Frank Clarks of the world, and it is a bit disconcerting that Baron Browning will be on physically unable to perform as training camp opens.
And unfortunately, I guess for the Broncos, that's one of the very few. Surtain, by the way, graded out Pro Football Focus, which you take some of that with a grain of salt, but second best overall cornerback in the league. Number one, actually, was rookie Sauce Gardner. They do favor a lot of man-to-man coverages over at Pro Football Focus, which is part of that, but also part of the reason that Surtain is also ranked as high as he is. So there are a couple stars, but it's not nearly as much as you might think. The Broncos will go into training camp in just about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how it all works out. They will come into it mostly healthy for the most part, but it is going to be a very interesting campaign. And of course, we're going to take a couple weeks off while the players and coaches take a couple weeks off. We'll be back after the 4th of July holiday where we can start getting into this season in earnest. But who better to help us set the scene than the one and only Sandy Clough? Sandy, thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Shawn. Thank you.
And we'll be back on as we record this. We'll be headed to do the show that we do every single weekday from 2 to 4 p.m., as we said, on Mile High Sports. You can check that out as well. Anyway, you get Mile High Sports, the app, the website, over the air. Thanks for listening. This podcast, of course, wherever you end up listening to it, thank you for listening to it as well. We hope you subscribe. We have a lot more coming next month and going into a very important and sea change season for the Denver Broncos. For Sandy Clough, I'm Shawn Drotar, SDROTAR on Twitter. Thanks for listening to the Broncos Blitz on Mile High Sports.